Hello, this video is the first video in a series of three that are intended to follow each sermon in this generosity series. This is kind of an experiment. We'll see how it goes. This one is intended to follow October 1st. Jesus, the Generosity of God was the title. So these go together. A couple of quick housekeeping things. We're mailing out pledge cards that look like this to everyone. You'll get that with a letter. You can bring that in on Sunday, October 15th. So please think about and pray about and talk about what you would consider pledging and giving toward the ministry and missions at Cornerstone for 2018. There'll be more information on that in the upcoming videos, but put that on your radar. You'll be receiving that. Also, if you have address or information changes, please utilize the cards that are in the Connect once in a while, or call the office and talk to Sandy or Brian. We don't make changes to people's information based on information on a check or return address or anything like that unless we hear from you that it needs to change. So please utilize that and keep us updated and informed on how best to contact you. Looking to John chapter 3, one thing that I left out of the sermon on Sunday that is very interesting to me is the discussion between Nicodemus and Jesus that leads up to the passage of John chapter 3, verses 16 to 21. So in verses 1 through 15, we have this Pharisee named Nicodemus who comes to Jesus at night. And there's an interesting back and forth about being born again, about the work of the Spirit, about what Israel's teachers should know. Jesus mentions Moses lifting a snake in the wilderness. You can find that in Numbers chapter 21. I believe it's verses 4 through 9. Just a real fascinating conversation. Now, one thing that I've learned recently is that the Jewish way of talking about things, especially religious or spiritual matters, is to debate. And the better the student and the more serious you are about the topic, the more questions you ask. So that's very different, I think, than our culture. We tend to think about if you're smart or you're a better student, you have answers. You know the right answer. And you can shut down conversation, essentially. What's fascinating with Jesus, who was a rabbi, or Nicodemus as a Pharisee, the better student you were, the better teacher you were, the better questions you asked, the more questions you could have. So, for example, if you could ask 3 questions about a passage, that was pretty good. If you could ask 15 questions, that was better. If you could ask 30 questions about a passage, that was even better. So the more questions you could ask, the richer the debate, the more disagreement, the more you dug in. That was the mode of operation. This is a good thing. So when we see Jesus and Nicodemus, I don't know what you import just culturally and with your assumptions to that passage about Jesus, his attitude toward Nicodemus. I had always read this passage as though he's maybe a bit cynical. Maybe Jesus is kind of tongue-in-cheek. Maybe he's upset at Nicodemus. Maybe he's treating him with a little bit of anger and disgust. I don't know, something like that. So if you read that passage, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, maybe pay attention to how the attitudes you import to the text as you read it. I would like to look at John 19. So in studying for October 1st sermon, I think I had heard it before, but I didn't pay attention. In 19, there's a fascinating thing after the crucifixion. It says this, starting in verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jews. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. It is just really fascinating that John makes a point to let us know that Nicodemus is involved here, honoring Jesus, responding with cost to himself, probably risk and danger to himself. There's a real response from him of generosity and grace towards Jesus. That makes me desire to read back into the story in chapter 3, that discussion, perhaps a little more favor of Jesus toward Nicodemus than I normally have brought into the text. So I think that conversation with Jesus and Nicodemus, although Jesus is teaching him for sure, I think it might have been marked with a lot more graciousness, compassion, generosity, and kindness that maybe we often read in. I don't know about you guys, but I grew up in a church tradition that unintentionally maybe or unknowingly, but for sure did perhaps communicate John 3:16 more as I would phrase it like this: God so hated the world that he killed his only son. Now, that's of course not what the text says. It says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. But I think sometimes, whether it's through our atonement theories or some of our doctrines and theologies, that we unintentionally bring to the text things that in fact aren't there, or even are a little bit opposite of what's there. So the Nicodemus feature in John is really, really interesting to me. I think it teaches us a lot about generosity, God's generosity to us, and the call for our response of generosity and openness toward God, but also toward others. So we'll be unpacking this in the next couple weeks. The last thing, very briefly, if you want to look at John chapter 13, it's just fascinating that John, at the Last Supper, his focus is really the foot washing stuff that's happening between Jesus and the disciples, and that interaction between him and Judas and him and Peter. And if you look at each text in John with this lens of generosity and grace and God sending and giving, it really, really shapes the reading of that text if you've never done that before. So I'd encourage you to do that. Maybe start with John 3, look at this passage in 19 about Nicodemus, maybe look at John 13 in the foot washing, and really God's graciousness and generosity to us. In the next 2 weeks, on October 8th and 15th, we're going to focus more on what then for us. How then do we respond if we receive this generosity and grace? How do we respond to God? How do we respond to others? And what does all that look like? So I look forward to that, spending time with you on those 2 weeks. Grace and peace. We'll talk to you soon.